All right. Well, welcome to Tuesday night. Looks like we've got a small group here tonight, but that's all right. That's all right. First of all, I know I normally send out a remind over the weekend or late in the weekend about Tuesday night's class and realized, as many of you saw about 10 minutes ago, that I hadn't sent one out this week, and I'm hoping that didn't tell people that there wasn't a class tonight. Maybe that's why we don't have as many people here as we sometimes do, but it is what it is. The topic for tonight is assessment. If we take a bit of a look back at what we've done over the first 8 weeks of this class, we've been working through sort of the first two phases of instructional design. The first one being focused on evaluation, on analysis, goal setting. And then from there, once we know what the goals are, moving into actually designing the steps of instruction by looking at what kind of learning is happening, coming up with a pathway of steps to lead students from point A to point B towards the goals, and so on. So the next piece of the puzzle is to talk about evaluation or assessment. Um, and I'm very deliberate about my use of the word assessment. Um, a lot of people will jump right to the word testing or quizzing, but we'll see why I do this. But basically, for me, the concept behind assessment is much broader, and I think much more useful than focusing on what we traditionally think of as testing. So that's why I force myself to type that word so many times and use that word so many times and actually use the word test very little. So this is going to be about assessment. The focus this week is on what I say assessment of learning, meaning that our focus is going to be on the assessing that we are designing for the students who are going to be experiencing our instructional design. So how do you know that the students have met the goals that you have set for them? We'll talk briefly next week about assessment of instruction, assessment for instruction, which is focused more on assessing the plan, assessing the instructional design itself. So that will be kind of looking the next couple of weeks at assessment both within your instructional designs, and then there will be an activity that's piece of next week's work where you'll be doing some evaluation uh, of the design itself and kind of where it is right now. So that is my thought. Um, so before we go any further, though, are there questions or concerns? I know that this week, technically, phase two was due, and most people have gotten those turned in. There's a couple people still working, which is fine. But sort of before we really move on into phase three of things, any remaining questions, concerns related to the phase two work, to planning, to types of learning, types of materials, tools, all that kind of work. Anything that I can address now before we move ahead. All right, sounds good. All right, so I'll just jump right into things for tonight. Let me, as I like to do, head over to um, hang on, head over to this. Here we go. Share that so we can see what's in Blackboard. All right, there we go. So this is just the overview for week 9. You can look over it. It really is focused on assessment. There's really only one assignment for this week, in addition to a couple of reading types of things. So this is going to be kind of a week to get wrapped up on phase two if you need it, and just kind of start to transition into thinking about the next phase. So what I would like to do is head over here to some notes. Feels like it's been several weeks since we've done an in-class discussion, since we've been focused on some individual meetings and some other things. So in terms of the topic of assessment, which I know is everybody's favorite. Anybody who's been a teacher, you're probably tired of hearing about, learning about, being instructed on the topic of assessment. But unfortunately, it's something that we as teachers just can't ignore. Um, the minute that we're putting a grade into a grade book or a learning management system, there's going to be somebody who's going to want to know what that grade means, where did it come from, what does it really show about the students, and so on and so on. So we can't ignore it as much as we'd like to, but from my perspective at least, assessment can be a lot more interesting than just, as I said at the beginning of the class, thinking about testing, because it is a lot more than testing. It covers a lot more ground. So there is a reading, and basically, we're not going to go over the reading now. It's something to look over the coming week. That is going to just kind of go back over some of the foundational information about assessment. But just to start off the discussion for tonight, I'd like to sort of start with this question of, based on your own experience, your own knowledge, your own thoughts, when we're talking about quality assessments, about assessments that do the thing that assessments are supposed to do, what are some of the qualities or some of the characteristics or the hallmarks that we would be looking for? Like if we were to come in and evaluate an assessment that a teacher is giving in a class, what are the things that you would be looking for in those assessments to say, yes, this is a high quality assessment that does what it needs to do, and so on. So it's going to be kind of just open discussion. So feel free to just sort of chime in, and I will take some notes here in the note wiki for the week. So what do you think? What do you know already about assessment? What have you learned about assessment? What are your thoughts? What sorts of things would you be looking for in a quality assessment?
It should like match with the objectives of the lesson.
Yeah, that's, I think, a great place to start. Why? I mean, maybe that's an obvious question, but why is that important?
Like if the assessment isn't assessing what the lesson was about, then it's not really like seeing if the kids learned what they're supposed to learn, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, we want to make sure. I mean, this sounds like a no-brainer, but you would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, how often students go through an experience of taking an assessment or completing an assessment on something that seems to have no relation to what they actually did in class or to what the teacher said they were going to be learning about. I've experienced this myself as a student, and I've certainly worked with enough students over the years to know that this happens. Um, so part of the reason that we bring in assessment now, after we've set the goals, after we've done the analysis, after we've planned for the instruction and seen what kind of steps the students need to go through, is precisely for this, so that when we design the assessment, we are not putting anything into the assessment that is not evaluating the students on the things that we need to know. There is no reason to have dead wood or extra stuff in an assessment just to pad it out or just to, look like it's doing what it needs to do. If you get the information you need and it's related to the goals, then that's what needs to be there. So stay focused on those goals and outcomes when you're working on a test. So one of the things I like to do when I'm creating an assessment is just like on a post-it or right at the top of the document I'm working on, I will put the goal, the learning goal, right at the top of the page. And I will do this for the actual version of the assessment that goes to the students. There's no reason that the students shouldn't also know what it is they are trying to demonstrate learning of. So a good trick you can do is to actually include some recap of the learning objective right there on the assessment. And that'll help focus your students too, because then they will be sort of thinking about what it is exactly that they're having to demonstrate. All right, so yes, that is a very good one to start with. What else? Is that it?
I guess also making sure it's like developmentally appropriate for the age group you're giving it to.
Sure. So again, we do the analysis piece first so that we have a really clear understanding of our students. And this is one of the reasons why, too. You need to make sure that not only the questions or the activities that they're being asked to do in the assessment are appropriate, but that the directions, the language of the directions are appropriate. If you need to support your students by including visual images that support the directions, um, in order to make sure that the age group you're working with can understand what they're supposed to do. So yeah, absolutely. We need to make sure that it's not only lined up with the goals, but also lined up with the students that are going to be taking the assessment. All right, other thoughts here.
Yes. What about feedback from the student?
You mean about their experiences with the assessment?
And what about the experience about what they're learning? How do you feel about what they're learning? Feedback.
Feedback from students about uh, their.
Okay. Let's say they're having they just had a lesson. Okay. I would like to know how you feel about this lesson. Do you think you learned something from this lesson? Tell me. Write down what you learned from this lesson, so I can assess or I can evaluate what how you feel about what you learned in this lesson.
Okay, yeah, and that idea can also bridge into a little bit of what we're going to talk about next week, which is this can be a good way for you to also get a sense of whether your instruction is doing what it's supposed to do, um, but also getting a read on the students' attitudes towards the assessment or towards what they learned. That can be a great way to then make future adjustments in instruction or future adjustments in assessments, um, and things like that. I mean, one thing that I'll throw in here that kind of goes off of that, I think, is that assessment is part. Here's me trying to talk and type at the same time. Is that any assessment, and we tend to think of this more with pre-assessments and formative assessments, but even summative assessments, even those like end of unit, end of lesson summative assessments, it's all part of a circular process. It's never here's the finish line. So any assessment they do, any assessment they complete, should be giving you information and giving the students information about what the next step is and helping to inform what the next step is. So if you find that their experiences with what they just learned were not generally positive, then going forward, you might need to make some adjustments in what's going on to either help them understand why they're learning what they're learning, give them a more positive frame of mind to move into whatever the next phase is. Maybe you need to take half a step back and readdress something that you've addressed already. But be careful of ever thinking like the assessment, the test is the finish line. Learning is never finished. We are lifelong learners. Everything we do, everything we learn feeds into the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So making sure that if every assessment you give somehow makes that connection back to the next step, gets the information for the students about how they learned, what they thought about their learning, so that that can then help to inform the next stage of things. So, another thing that I'll put in here, and then I'll open up the floor again, um, is not only getting feedback from the students, but make sure that the assessments give information back to the students. It should not be some black box that their work just disappears into and then they see a grade on a report card. Whatever they do, the assessment should have some mechanism in place that helps get the information back to the student about how they did so that they can be prepared to move on to the next thing. All right, I'll shut up then again. What else? Have we covered everything? If we were teacher instructors or evaluators and going into someone's classroom and watching them do an assessment activity, is this all the things that we would be looking for? Is there anything else we'd like to throw on this list? All right. Well, we'll leave it here for now. If we come up with other things, we can always add them onto the list. And one of the things, like I said, there's a reading for this week, a chapter on sort of assessment design and just sort of some of the underlying concepts of assessment. And there may be some things that come out of that chapter too that may trigger some ideas. So I just want you, as we move forward into our instructional design process, want you to be thinking about some of these things as you're moving forward. There is one other that I'm going to put in here because I've already talked about it a couple times tonight, but it really has become one of my mantras, one of my broken record moments when I'm dealing with people and talking about assessment, and that is that assessments do not see. I can't type and talk at the same time. Do not mean just tests. Um, so I encourage each of you to get creative when it comes to the idea of assessment. And particularly because we are in a technology program, and we'll talk about this in a little bit here, but using technology to assess students, especially if you're sort of talking about traditional testing types of assessments, um, technology-based assessments on those lines can be problematic. And if you're not willing to think outside the box, if for you assessment just means asking students a bunch of questions that they answer and then giving them points on those answers, you're going to get stuck pretty quickly when you start trying to incorporate technology into things because those types of assessments don't translate very well, especially to online technology situations, to like asynchronous learning situations. So think about, assessment is just anything that gives you information about student learning. So it could be a project, it could be an essay, it could be an interview, it could be a discussion, it could be a forum, it could be, anything. Yes, it can be a question and answer kind of test. I'm not saying those don't exist and that they're not valid, but they are not the only tool. I encourage you to think a little outside the box. And if you keep in mind the first thing we talked about here, which is the goals, don't say to yourself, what questions do I need to ask a student to know if they've learned this? Drop the question bit and just say, what can a student do that would show me that they understand this thing? If I was teaching a shop class, and maybe this is kind of an obvious example, but if I want a student to show me that they know how to, use a wood lathe, sure, I could ask them a bunch of questions, and that might tell me that they understand, how a lathe works and what tools to use and how to hold the tools and all that. But I could learn just as much by literally having the student go and make something on the lathe, and I observe them or video what they've done. And in the end, that's going to give me the exact same information that the paper test would have given me, but gets away from that idea that testing or assessment just has to mean asking questions and getting answers. There's many, many, many different ways to do this. So the more project-based you can think, the more authentic assessment you can think, generally the more valid these are going to be. All right. So what I'd like to do now is ask all of your help in, we're going to kind of set the stage for a specific testing scenario, a specific assessment scenario. So we want to pick, a subject area and like state a SMART goal that might be something that would be evaluated through an assessment. And this, if any of you have something that you use in your classroom right now, we can certainly use that as an example. If you don't mind us picking it apart a little bit and doing some reimagining. But I would like these at this point to just focus on, what would be sort of maybe considered traditional in class, in person types of assessments where the teacher is there in the room with the students, not necessarily any technology involved. So it doesn't have to be a paper and pencil test, but something that's more along traditional lines, non-technology based, in person, something that happens in a classroom that is an assessment type of activity. So does somebody have something that they would like to throw out that we can then bat around a little bit and have some discussion of? Does anybody have an example from a class that you teach?
Yes. Uh, After each group that I facilitate, after an hour, hour and a half, I like to pass out a form that states that asks two questions. It states the topic, okay? Then I want them to write down what was the topic about, and then I ask, how will you apply what you learned in this group? And they'll say, well, I will apply what I learned in this group by XYZ. Or they might say, I wouldn't apply because I don't understand it, or I no. But usually they will tell me how they can apply what they learned in the group.
Okay.
Basically, yeah. They'll say, uh, I will apply what I learned in this group by so and so, so and so, and so and so. So this way it gives me an idea that they got the message, the goal, the point, and they're willing to try because they understand what the topic was.
Okay. So if we were to, that sort of describes the assessment instrument. So what would, if we were to put something in like, what would be the SMART goal for that class that would lead up to this assessment at the end of the class? So, it'd be something like, by the end of this class, students will, and what would it be? What would an example be, for, say, a given class day? What would you be looking for them to know by the end of the class?
Okay, I will be looking for them to repeat back to me what they learned and how they feel what they learned, and again, how they can use it in their life. How can they?
Okay.
How can they? How
Do
can they use? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can you give us like a specific example from a specific class?
Okay. Okay.
what would a topic of a class be that then at the end of it you want them to be able to answer this? So
Okay. For example, my last group was this called Social Survival Manual. Okay, and this is about clients when they are learning to go back into society. Okay, how to react and interact with other people. Okay,
okay. So
and
a smart goal might be something by the end of the class, students will be able to, maybe something like, describe several strategies, for uh,
social, socializing and intermingling with, you know,
uh, students will describe several strategies for socializing. Okay, we can sort of leave it at that, right?
oh
So
yeah, and also most importantly, I think is how to interact on the work site
okay, for socializing in the workplace.
in the
All right.
workplace. Yeah.
Okay. So just so we have kind of a specific scenario in mind that we can do. So if we were designing the instruction for this, we would have gone through all the analysis, and we say that by the end we come up with this. Um, and the way that the current assessment sits, it's got this 2 question thing at the end, um, that they're being asked. All right, so that's setting the stage for our scenario. So let me sort of open this up, and again, with your blessing, Jesse, we're gonna take a look at this as a group and see if there's anything that we would modify about it or other ideas we could come up with. So maybe for the rest of you, kind of looking at this and looking at the assessment, are there any suggestions that you might have? Does this sound like a useful assessment tool for this goal? Is there anything that you would suggest, as an addition to it or a modification of it? Keeping in mind some of the things that we talked about with these, sort of the quality of the or the hallmarks of quality assessments. Anybody?
I guess like depending on what the specific strategy is, like say if it's just like I don't know, like maintaining eye contact in conversations, like maybe like a role play thing where like you can assess like are they maintaining eye contact during conversations? Like just like practicing the skill, but while practicing it, you're also like note taking to see if they're actually doing it, if that makes any sense.
Okay. So kind of asking the students to actually put the knowledge into some sort of practical application. Hang on, I'm just trying to. Where's my everything moves around when I zoom in like this? Oh, there it is. All right, so back to here. All right, so doing something like that. Again, this doesn't involve any technology. It would be another strategy um, where and again one of the things you want to think about is sort of aligning with your students' interests and their comfort level. So, maybe you have a student that's not so good with writing. They're not comfortable writing ideas down or reflecting on their ideas in that kind of a way, in a written way. So maybe having an option where the students can just demonstrate the learning instead of writing it down. Okay, that's a good idea. Any other ideas from the rest of the class here? It's an awfully quiet class tonight. Small group.
Uh, I also, can I say something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I also noticed that when they're talking about applying what they just learned or read about or role play, it brings up a lot of past experiences. Okay. And they say, yeah, this is good that I'm learning how to do this because in the past, um, I felt rejected because I didn't step out of my comfort zone. So now, in order to avoid rejection, I will make a move and try to meet somebody. I try to talk and be the one to initiate a conversation to avoid being rejected.
Okay. Yep. So having the students also includes connections to past experiences to maybe give some more meaning to the learning that they've done.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, if we go back, again, it's part of the exercise of assessment is keeping it aligned to the goals. So our goal, at least as we've stated it here, and again, it may be different, Jesse, in your actual classes, but students will be able to describe several strategies for socializing in the workplace. So, what we have this word describe in here, and we've already talked about or already come up with at least one idea that would maybe widen that goal out to, um, not just describing, but maybe it would be demonstrating an understanding of or demonstrating a knowledge of. So here's a place where one of the things that will come up in the reading for this week is that you want your assessments to be practical, meaning that there are a lot of great ideas for assessing, but they're not always practical in the classroom. So you may get to a point in instructional design where when you start actually looking at, well, how am I going to actually know whether students have gotten this? You might be going backwards and making adjustments to your goal. So what we might find here is that what we're really interested in is not just that they describe it, but that they're able to demonstrate an understanding of. And then that can open us up to not just descriptive answers, but could also be demonstration based answers or things like that. So, yeah, so again, this is a pretty contained goal. It's pretty straightforward. It's really focused on a sort of a particular one little narrow topic. Um, but one of the things I want you to get out of this or to think out of this is if you ever take a moment and take a look at an assessment that you do right now, and maybe it's an assessment you've been giving the same way for 5 years or 10 years, or in my case, I've got some assessments that I've been using in one form or another for 20 years. Um, Always be willing to kind of take a step back and say, is this assessment actually doing the thing that I want it to do? Sometimes we kind of get blinders on about just, well, this is the way we've always assessed this. But if you think, even without including technology, without putting any fancy bells and whistles in, you might find some alternate ways. And there's also a lot of focus these days on giving students choice. So not necessarily that you are telling every student now, oh, well, you've got to role play these strategies, but give your students a menu of options that they could choose from. If each one of them will show you what you need to know about the student, then there's no reason not to allow the students to have choice over how they want to show that. Some may want to write it down, some may want to talk about it, some may want to demonstrate it. So, if you have an assessment that you've done over and over and over again, maybe start thinking about, can you kind of expand the menu? And if you keep your goal in mind, as long as you can say each version of this assessment activity will give me the information about the students that I need to know, then giving them that choice can be a really powerful tool. So then the students start to take ownership in the assessments. One of the classes I teach is this Intro to Modern Band class, and the students are working on a multitude of instruments. And they are setting the goals that they want to achieve on those instruments. And then they're also designing how they're going to show me that they've learned their goal in the end. And I'll work with them on that. We'll have discussions about what those assessments look like. But it really gives the students a sense of empowerment when they're the ones that get to help decide what's the best way that I can show that I've understood this particular thing. So I'm just going to put down here as kind of a closer on this: variety of options, give students choice if possible. It may not always be practical, but if you have the ability to give a couple of different options for assessment, that can be a really powerful way to go. All right, so now the next thing I want to do, and we don't need to take a ton of time with this particular version because I do want to talk about the next one, is, so let's take this same assessment, the same topic, the same goal, and if we wanted to bring technology into the picture, but in this case, it's still going to be in person. So this would be a situation where the teacher is still in the classroom with the students. They want to assess this thing, but now we're saying we can bring technology into the picture to help us with this assessment. What kinds of things could we add into this assessment picture that would incorporate technology into it? What are some thoughts?
Uh, we can record the demonstration that the
Yeah,
students, yeah, recording.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's almost a no-brainer with what we've talked about so far, especially when we talked about this role play. So, some students may be hesitant about demonstrating in the classroom with a bunch of people around, but maybe they can go off into a separate room or a hallway and just video themselves doing it, and then that way they can be comfortable that they kind of have control over the performance, and then they can submit to you what they feel is their best version of what they need to do. And then that also gives you the advantage as the teacher of having something that you can go back and examine multiple times whenever you have a moment to. Doesn't have to be right in the moment. So that could be a really good way to get individual assessments from a range of students without sort of needing to watch them all at the same time and split yourself into a number of people. So it could be videoing that like demonstrations. What else could we use video or recording for in this case? What's another way that students could use a recording in this particular assessment situation? Very quiet people tonight. What about for those students that want to answer just the questions? If we go back to these two questions, um, they may want to just answer the questions, but maybe they're not comfortable writing them, or they want to just be able to kind of talk about the answers. So that would be another way to bring recording into the picture. Is that they could answer those questions sort of verbally and either do an audio recording or a video recording of them just answering the questions. What else? There's another one. If you think about the current version of the assessment, and you're thinking technology, I can see at least one pretty obvious route that probably a lot of you already use some version of. Testing my wait time skills tonight. All right, what about putting the form online? All right, so this would be a way to, just maybe give a different option or to incorporate technology. Um, a lot of schools are now Google, so you could set up a Google form, Microsoft form. You could even use, for something like this, you could even get into using something like Kahoot or one of those other online platforms where students have the ability to answer questions through an online format. Kahoot may not be so good if you're looking for individual answers from the students, but something along those lines, or one of those online assessment tools that will allow you to get a quick read from the students on these two questions. And again, the nice thing about that is it's a different option. I have at least two students right now that part of their modifications are that they don't they are not expected to handwrite anything. And honestly, I don't know the background. I don't know if it's because they just don't handwrite. I don't know if they have fine motor skill issues. It doesn't really matter. Their accommodation states that they are supposed to have the ability to type all of their work and submit it digitally. So if at this point, I just make this part of my universal design. Anything that I give out in paper, I make a digital form of too, whether that's a Word document or something like that. And I tell all the students, you can either take the paper version and write your answers in, you can use the Word version and type your answers in and send it in to me. And it doesn't really matter. I get the same information either way, but it helps to support students and again gives students that choice of how they want to demonstrate, what mode they want to demonstrate. Um, so yeah, so things like that. So there's a range. You can bring, technology. Part of the thing that technology gives us is options. Is that it helps take tasks that in the past we had sort of a very limited range of tools, and just gives us a whole additional range to work with when it comes to anything in the classroom. But assessment is no different. That it just gives us a new set of tools. So, one of the main things that I'm going to be asking each of you to think about this week, and there's uh, there's a little bit of separate reading that will touch on this, and actually the chapter touches a little on this too. But this is to now take it the final step. So we have the original assessment task, which was just no technology in the classroom, pen and paper kind of a thing, and some other ideas for how to do that. Now we've incorporated technology, but still in a synchronous setting, so the teachers can be there to observe the students and to help them. So now we're going to take it into the third realm, which is online asynchronous type of an environment. So let's now go back to our original scenario, and let's say this is a class now that is being delivered online. So the topics, the strategies for socializing in the workplace were presented in an online class, and through videos or through other pages of information online, readings, et cetera, et cetera. So now in this online environment, um, we are interested in assessing this same thing. We want to know, did they get what they needed to out of the class, and do they know how they're going to apply it? So just generically, not specifically this scenario, but generically, when we move an assessment completely online, asynchronous, what are the major challenges? There's one big one that kind of encompasses the main challenge. You're giving a test, you've put that test online, your students are completing the test online, submitting it to you, and you're using that test information, that assessment information, to generate a grade. What is the challenge of that scenario?
Um, Go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was gonna say I can't think of like the right word, but like ensuring they're not cheating on the assessment, like looking up answers or like doing it with a partner.
Exactly. There are some other challenges, some technical challenges, but if you wanted to boil the main online issue down, it is exactly that. And if we wanted to use a better, or not a better word, but a less pointed word than cheating, we might say validity, right? We want to know that the data we are getting from an assessment is actually a representation of that student's knowledge, abilities, skills, whatever it happens to be. So the minute you are not there to be looking over the students' shoulders and observing their practice and making sure that they're not doing what they're not supposed to, even the best intentioned of students will start to look for ways to game the system. It's kind of just human nature in a way. So, the challenge when you move any assessment online is to try to think about, how are we going to get the information we need to know, but in a way where we can be as sure as we can be. There will always be students that figure out how to work around it, but to be as sure as we can be that the data we're getting from the students is actually valid. So to come back to our initial thing here, um, what was the top of the class about? How you apply what you learned. So we've taught this class online. They've watched their videos, whatever. They get to this little 2-question thing, and all we've done is post it online as like a Google form, and they're supposed to go onto the form and answer these 2 questions. So the most obvious thing that's going to happen, to go off of what Carly just said, is student A happens to be also on their phone on a FaceTime call with student B, and they sit down and they're like, "Oh, did you do the 2 questions for the class? I didn't get a chance to look through it, but what were the answers?" And then student B will say, "Oh, well, the class was about this, and here's what I put down for the other question." And then the other student goes, "Oh, okay," and they just fill in the form, submit it. And from our end, from the teacher's end, we'd go, "Oh, okay, they looked through it, they got the right topic of the class, and They talked a little bit about how they would apply it. And maybe we might notice that there's some similarities between some of the students, but we wouldn't necessarily have grounds to say, oh, well, you two must have been copying from each other. Maybe there's enough of a difference, but we don't know. We have no way of knowing. So how could we work around that? What is some things we could do to learn what we need to learn, but to do it in a way where we can be as sure as we can be that the student is actually demonstrating their actual understanding.
Well, we can not have just one question. We can have, individual questions tailored for that particular student. Uh, so if you have 15 students, each student gets a different question.
All right. Yeah, this is a very common online strategy. A lot of online testing software um, gives the option of creating word or question banks, where a teacher can provide multiple versions of a question that are all different enough from each other that one answer won't answer all of them. So immediately the students, and there will be students who will go around and they will try to collect all the different versions of the questions and try to get all the answers to all the different versions. But that's a lot of work. And generally, students who are trying to game the system are not trying to create more work for themselves. So if you can make it more difficult, this works really well, obviously, with things like math types of questions. If you're trying to test order of operations understanding, then there's obviously multiple different questions you could answer that would show the student's knowledge of order of operations, but they're all different. So the end answer would be different. And then, yeah, students may still ask each other, but then that means students are having to do two people's questions. And again, they're going to be less likely, they're going to be more likely to focus on their answer and make sure that they're getting a good grade than taking the time to help somebody else answer their question. So, yeah, that's a very common strategy, one that tends to work pretty well. It does mean more work for you as the teacher because now you're having to come up with multiple questions. But nice thing is, once you kind of build that bank of questions, then that's usually something you can come back to. Another thing that a lot of the online assessment software does is they will randomize. Once you've given a bank of questions, every time a student takes that test, it pulls a different group of questions in a different order. So even if the same student takes the test multiple times, they're not just memorizing answers, they're getting a different set of questions each time. So that can be another way to keep things valid if it's something that a student may be doing more than once. All right. What's another strategy? That's a really strong one. What else could we think of that would help guarantee or at least assure us of validity?
Some like online assessments, like this is more for like question and answer type of assessments, but like sometimes they're time sensitive. Like once you start it, they give you a certain amount of time to submit it.
Okay. Yeah. And again, this is another uh, very common strategy in online assessment. It's not a guarantee, but what you're trying to do here is sort of outgame the students who are trying to game the system. And, again, if they know that they have X amount of time to get an answer in, they're going to be less likely to spend that time either helping another student answer their questions or trying to look up an answer somewhere. If they know that the clock's ticking, it's going to at least take away some of their comfort with sort of saying, "Oh, I could take all the time I want. I could go look this up on 5 different websites and see what I can find out, or I could go call my friend and see what they said." So yeah, either timing questions or timing the whole assessment, because then again, a student is going to tend to want to get their work done if they know they have a fixed amount of time, and they're going to be less likely to want to spend some of that time working with someone else or helping someone else, especially if we combine it with the first one and students are getting different questions, even if they're on the phone with each other at the same time, they're not going to want to be spending that time helping another student answer their questions if they know they've got a different question they've got to answer and the clock is ticking. So, yeah, if you have the ability, that's another tool, and a lot of online assessment instruments or apps will do that. What else? Again, think outside the box. Does this have to be that sort of a test? Is there other things that we could do that would give us a better, more assurance that the students are the ones generating the work?
Okay, perhaps we can make sure or state that the answer is based on creativity or competition. You know, and how you say promote competition. Okay, so it's if you get the best answer, the best unique individual answer, then you'll be the best one to answer the question. But
Okay.
has to be individual, it has to be competitive, and it has to be singular.
Yeah. So maybe, if you sort of give the students some latitude in terms of how they're demonstrating, because if there's a range of ways of showing their knowledge, if you get two students that submit the exact same way of demonstrating it, then that gives you a bit of a clue that they were probably collaborating in some way. Um, if it's something a little more on the creative side, it's unlikely that multiple students might come up with the exact same way of doing it. So if you're looking for that individuality of it, so yeah, or I mean, we can go back to this one that we talked about, the recording idea, because again, if somebody's having to make a video demonstration of something, I mean, at the very least, that it's them, the one that's they're the ones doing the demonstration or doing the talking. I mean, yeah, they might have discussed ideas for what they're going to do with someone else, but in the end, they're the ones doing the demonstration. So to go back to our idea of like this, role playing sort of a thing, if they're, oh, I realized I misspelled that. If they're having to do role playing types of things, if you've got a video um, of that work, they could submit that video through an online tool as well. That could be something that's not just for in the classroom, um, but also something that could be submitted online. And that would then tie into the creativity piece of it, the individuality piece of it, where they're having to come up with, maybe for the role play, maybe they have to create a script that they have to demonstrate. And that way, the script kind of guarantees that each student has done their work because the scripts are all going to be different from each other. Um, so yeah, it's a kind of a tough nut to crack, and you know, obviously a lot of the super high stakes assessments now are all online. The SATs are online. The PSATs are online. Um, and in those situations, they are combating this by having a proctor in the room. The students are having to use devices that have safe browsers, where if the student tries to go anywhere other than the assessment, it actually logs them out of the assessment. So that keeps students from looking up answers on, at least on the device that they're on, collecting phones, things like that. So there are ways to achieve online assessment that are valid, but it always takes a little bit of thought. You have to get creative. I won't say that it will never work, but almost never, if you take something that's just a traditional in-class pen and paper test and just put those questions online, it is doubtful that the results you will get from that experience are going to be very valid at all. So you can still get the same data. You might just have to get creative about how you collect that data and what strategies you use. So I just want you thinking about this. There's a lot of different directions we could go, a lot of different ideas we could incorporate. There's all kinds of apps out there now that help with online assessment or even in-person assessment. They all have their strengths and weaknesses and so on. So as we go into the next couple of weeks and you're thinking about your instructional design, um, I just want to encourage you to think outside the box. It doesn't mean, even on summative assessments, that summative assessment doesn't automatically mean pen and paper test. It could be a project, a demonstration, a video, a performance, a paper, an essay, a story, a radio ad. I mean, there's so many different ways that students could demonstrate their knowledge and their learning, and giving students options will give them ownership over the assessment process. So I just want to start wrapping up tonight by then sort of just talking about the work from this week, which is relatively minimal. As I said, there's a reading chapter that will cover some of the same ground we talked about tonight, but in a little bit more detail. So there's nothing you have to do with that. You don't have to, write a reflection on it or anything like that. Just take a look through it. I did provide a second page here. Oops, I have it hidden. Why is it hidden? Make available. I have a second page here that's just my sort of thoughts and follow up on the chapter. So that'll just, once you've read the chapter, you can look through this page, and I just try to pull out some of the most pertinent points that I want you to think about. There's a second reading here, which is optional. I always throw this one into the mix. It's it's basically a collection of um, summaries of a bunch of different research papers that all relate to assessment, and particularly to formative assessment. So it's fairly lengthy, and each one is basically just given a paragraph that sort of summarizes that particular research. But if you're somebody who likes to get into research behind things and you want to learn some more about assessment practices and about some of the research behind it, this would give you a good place to start to like look up. Some of these papers are available online, or you'll be able to find more in-depth versions of them and so on. So I'm more providing this as kind of an additional resource, as opposed to, I don't expect all of you to read through every single summary of every single one. So that's just there as an additional support. And then really, like I said, the only real assignment this week is a forum in which you're going to start to present your ideas about how you're going to incorporate assessment into your instructional design plan project. So I'm doing it again in the structure of a forum, so that you can share ideas with each other and get feedback from each other. A number of you are working on similar topics, so it might be informative to kind of see what kinds of assessment ideas people are coming up with. Or even if it's not your same topic, you might see somebody taking a certain assessment approach and go, hey, that would work really well in my situation too. So I just want everyone to kind of start creating this bank of ideas. I put the forum instructions on a separate page, again, just because of the way that Blackboard works with the forums. You don't see the instructions until you create a new thread. This way, you've got the instructions. You can type up your whole post in Word or whatever, and then just copy and paste it into the actual forum once you have it completed. But basically, I want you to talk about pre-assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. within your instructional design plan. And I'm not asking you to actually create the assessments. This is just describing what sorts of things do you think you're going to do before they've started learning? What things are you going to do to assess while they're learning? And then what are you going to do at the end to see whether they reach the goals that you set in phase one? So just, I don't know, a few sentences on each. If you are going to be incorporating technology into your instructional design, maybe just add a couple of thoughts about how you see that working, whether it's in-class technology or asynchronous technology. But if you see that that may be a piece of your instructional design plan, you can also add some information about that. So just type it up, a couple, 2, 3 paragraphs, paste it into the forum. And then, as always, as people start to post their posts, just come back, check in, see if there's a couple you want to comment on or provide some feedback on. But the actual forum is here. And for this one, everybody will be creating their own thread. So this will be a multi-thread forum as opposed to some of them we've done where we're all contributing to the same thread. So that's the work for this week, is basically just read a chapter, look through my information about that chapter, and then do this forum post. Next week, I will make available phase 3 for the instructional design project. That is going to be, no big surprise, on assessment. So you will be getting into a little more detail there about your actual assessment plan. And then the other thing we're going to talk about next week is alpha testing your instructional designs. And that's going to be that other element of assessment for instruction, which is assessing the instructional plan, not the assessment of the students as they're going through the instruction, but actually getting some feedback on the quality of the actual instructional design. And I call that alpha testing as opposed to beta testing, which will come a little later on down the road. So next week will be kind of part 2 of assessment. And then we'll be moving on after that to doing some instructional materials creating for a few weeks, kind of shifting gears a bit. All right. So that is this week. So if you have questions, as always, reach out. And if you are still finishing up phase 2, take your time. I'd rather you have the work done in a way that you feel you're satisfied with. And then from there, we'll move on to phase 3 starting next week. All right. Any final thoughts or questions for the evening? Well, I appreciate the 5 of you making it here. And next week we'll follow up, and we are well past the halfway point now. So we're starting to head back downhill towards the end. So thank you all for tonight, and let me know if you have questions. And as always, I will hang out in the room until everyone has left. So if you want to stay and bend my ear a bit, that is fine. But if not, have a great night and have a good week.